And on Tuesday, so it's time for the history of the world to begin. This course is one that I haven't taught before, and to the best of my knowledge, no one else at Columbia has taught it before, because world history has generally been regarded as a subject that either cannot or should be taught at elite universities. It has been a very unusual area of history in that instead of deriving from the thought and writings of famous historians, it has emerged from the ground up, from essentially it's a demand side course that comes out of the K through 12 educational system. And I need to tell you a little bit about how that occurred in order for you to understand how I'll approach this course. During the 60s and 70s, you all know enough about history to know that we had a profoundly transforming civil rights movement, accompanied and even more followed by a feminist movement, along with a very strong increased awareness of the role of Native Americans and immigrant groups from non-European backgrounds. And the result of this educationally was that in the school systems, both college but even more pre-college, it became understood that American history should be taught as a history that embodies diversity. That provoked a certain opposition of people who said that multiculturalism is somehow a betrayal of American values and principles. But by and large, a multicultural or diversity-oriented narrative of American history became the standard in the American school systems. To a lesser degree in other parts of the world, to a much lesser degree. The problem was that if you went back and taught American history this way, how far back could you go? You could go back to 1776, you could go back and maybe do a century of colonial American history. But there's a problem that if you wanted to get the earlier take on history that would meld with the new ways of teaching American history, you were going to have a narrative that manifested the same degree of diversity or of, say, cultural relativism, or at least appreciation of different cultures, that you had for the new American history courses. And yet the way history was taught is that Western Civ was the broad context within which American history was placed. And Western Civ was a narrative constructed in a very, somewhat artificial fashion, starting from Egypt to Mesopotamia, migrating to Greece, migrating to Europe, forgetting Ethiopia, forgetting Egypt and Mesopotamia and Greece, becoming the Roman Empire, becoming the Dark Ages, becoming the Renaissance, the Reformation, the early modern period, Industrial Revolution, and us. So you had a master narrative of how Europe got to be Europe that was just fine as a preamble for American history, so long as the only Americans you were interested in teaching were white Americans of European background. So now you had a problem, that you had a history that was developing for American history courses in a diverse fashion, coming on top of a broader history that was Eurocentric. Well, not exclusively Eurocentric, because Egypt and Mesopotamia are not in Europe, but we forget about Egypt and Mesopotamia once we get the Greeks revved up and going. So we had a Eurocentric history that didn't match the American history. So the result was that various educators in various states started to agitate for global awareness or global studies. And in the course of time, 20 or 30 states mandated that global studies of some sort be taught, so that there was some kind of a linkage between the way American history was being rethought and the way history broadly was thought. This job went initially to social studies teachers who had been around for several generations, usually taught in elementary schools, and now they were charged with global studies, and that a problem developed because social studies teachers tended to have a chronological depth of about 10 years. And so they couldn't do that part of history that would dovetail with the early stages of American history. So a sort of a coup came about in the 1980s in which high school history teachers fought with and succeeded in grasping from the social studies teaching network the teaching of world history. Now these history teachers were teachers of American history and of Western Civ. None of them had ever taken world history. But it was a kind of a turf war. They said, we're historians, we deal with the past. You want to do the past differently, you go through us. You don't go hire somebody else. No, we do the history. And so they kicked the social studies teachers out. I may be exaggerating. And now it became the job of history teachers, particularly in high school, to carry out the state mandates for global awareness, global studies, and so forth. Now the problem was that none of the people who were now going to teach world history had ever taken world history, because world history wasn't taught in American universities. I remember in the 90s going to seminars on how to teach world history, in which you might have 100 high school teachers, and if you took a show of hands, how many of you are teaching world history? They'd all raise their hand and say, how many of you have taken world history? And no one would raise their hand. And this was a terrible problem, because you had people who had no qualifications to teach world history, who were now teaching it by mandate, and they were struggling, to say the least. And we're talking about 10,000 plus teachers nationwide who had to do this, in addition to coaching the soccer team or whatever else they were expected to do. This was seen as a crisis by certain organizations. The College Board brought together a workshop of senior historians and high school teachers to talk about how to do it. The National Council for the Humanities funded a project to create a master outline for world history involving, I think, 8 senior professors of history, none of whom either taught or had studied world history. The meetings of the committee were essentially turf wars. We need more in China. No, we need more in India, and so forth. We never would have finished the job if our professor of Japanese history had not been absent on the last day, because she was not going to give up any turf to the rest of us.
rough.